this is kind of a thread of work that has finished now, but is always open to continuing, right? So this is some stuff I did back when I was at RMIT and at the University of Melbourne. I'm now up here at the University of Queensland. So the context of the talk will be mostly on IR topics. Building reusable test collections is actually where this work originated. But we'll talk a little bit more about the actual crowd working and some of the interesting things that came out from what we saw. So just to start off with, in case you're not really familiar with how the field of information retrieval does experimentation, typically we want to build reusable collections so we can run experiments. We can measure, model improvements, different things. So what we do typically is we take a corpus of documents and we build a set of topics that relate to those documents in some way. From those topics, we derive queries. And then initiatives like Clay or Trek or these, there's a ton of them basically, they give these collections and the queries to research groups. The research groups have their own IR systems, different models and so on. And they basically try and submit runs to see how their system performs on these new queries. And so after you submit these runs, and usually groups would submit many runs and there would be many groups, so you can have hundreds and hundreds of results per query. You get judges to look at those. You might pull them in a certain way to avoid sort of blowing up the cost of the annotation process. And what you get left with is a set of essentially positive or negative labels as to whether a document satisfies the information need from the original topic. And in the end, this is sort of what you're left with. You have the topics, the queries that come from them, the document corpus, and you've got labels or what we call QRELs, which allow us to do evaluation. So the interesting thing is that in a lot of these evaluation campaigns, usually a single query would be developed for each topic. So for example, there's a topic here about dark chocolate health benefits. What are the benefits or what are the health benefits associated with eating dark chocolate? And so the most natural query perhaps comes out to be dark chocolate health benefits. Now, if you're sitting here thinking, well, that's not the query I would have run, hopefully that's the point, right? So different users actually formulate different queries for the same information need. So different people have different ways of formulating queries, even though their information needs might be exactly the same. So for example, for that same topic, someone might query benefits of eating dark chocolate. Somebody else might query dark chocolate health benefits. Somebody else might query, is dark chocolate healthy, and so on, right? And so these are called user query variations or UQVs. There's been a little bit of research or actually quite a lot of research now in the last sort of decade about these and how they're useful. But typically they bring a lot more diversity into ranked retrieval runs. So if you're building a search system, you should be aware that you'll have variations like this. And it turns out that sometimes different queries for the same topic can perform vastly differently, right? So it's important to know about this and to understand how they work. And it's also important to consider these when you're conducting those evaluation campaigns that we talked about before, when you're building or trying to build reusable test collections. So a natural question arises, how do you generate these things? Or, how do we deal with these things? And so one of the more recent works in 2016, it's a collection called UQV 100. Their idea was to build a backstory for every topic. So for example, the topic here is about trees. And so the backstory reads, many tree species look alike. And so it's easy to mistake one for another. So on and so forth. Your friend thinks they have this Norway spruce tree in their garden, but you don't think it is. You decide to try and identify whether this tree is the tree that your friend thinks it is. And the point here is that the backstory is written so the user or the crowd worker can try and empathize with this sort of backstory. And so what you're going to do is you're going to give this to a crowd worker and you're going to ask them, what query would you submit to a search engine, right? And that's basically how you can collect UQVs. Now, it's quite interesting. You get a lot of variants coming back. Perhaps you would expect that Norway spruce is the most common one, but you do see variations, images, trees, tree, picture identification, even verbose ones like how to identify a Norway spruce. And there's actually a whole bunch of other ones that aren't shown here as well. So a huge amount of variability, even for this one quite simple topic. So is there a problem with this? Well, we thought possibly. So by providing a text backstory to crowd workers, are we essentially priming them to use specific keywords? Are we telling the worker, look, here's some text, copy and paste stuff, or here are some keywords you should be using? And is that bad? Is that going to bias our experimentation? And are we actually encouraging the crowd workers to take shortcuts, as I alluded to? Are they just going to copy and paste the text, right? So that's sort of some of the questions we were asking ourselves. And as scientists, as people who are curious, we always ask if we can do something better. And so we try, and sometimes we do, and sometimes we fail. So in this work, what we did is we tried to build some alternatives to plain text backstories. And this was done in the context of building a new collection. And this collection was built over a large set of news documents out of the Common Crawl News collection, where we actually filtered out a subset of English documents and built a corpus. So what we did is we generated 3 backstories of different lengths for each topic. So first, we created a set of topics by sampling documents randomly. And then we created 3 different lengths of backstories. So the first one was we just took the document's title. And because these are news documents, the title was often a very short and representative description of what the document was about. And then we used automatic summarization tools to build a short and a long summary of the document as well. And so that gave us different lengths of topics and backstories, but we also were interested in providing these to users in different ways, or to crowd workers in different ways. So what we did is we first took an image of the text so that they couldn't copy and paste. So we thought, I'll talk more about that later, and some of you are probably thinking, you already know what's going to happen here. But we also used some text-to-speech engines from Microsoft, and what's interesting is that you can change the intonation or the way that the text is, read out, and you can actually ask for it to be read as if it was from a newscaster, so somebody reading the news. And this was really interesting because this is news documents. So when you get this summary and you put it into a text-to-speech engine like a newscaster, it sounds like somebody reading the news. And so what we did then, we basically gave those to crowd workers and we asked them to generate queries. Here's an example of the 3 backstories for one particular topic. We had the title was Arctic heating up twice as fast as rest of the globe. Then we had a short summary and a long summary. And it's worth noting here that the long summary, the short summary is actually a subset of the long summary. So the long summary is just adding on extra text to the short one. And so here's kind of what we ended up with. We had two ways of conveying the information. One was an image of text, one was audio, and we had very short titles, short summaries, and long summaries. And so what we wanted to know is, do these different backstory properties, or the way we deliver them to crowd workers, does it affect the queries that they end up generating, right? Because that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to generate varied sets of queries. We were interested in seeing how the variability changes, basically. So the first thing we did was some intrinsic analysis. We took the query variations that we generated from the crowd workers. We stratified them into the 6 sets that I just showed you. And then we analyzed the difference between the sets, or within the sets, to try and understand more about the variance. And so the most obvious thing to look at first was the length of the queries that come out. And so comparing the text and the audio, the first thing you might notice looking across all of the title, short or long, is that generally with the text backstories, we got longer queries coming out. Now, if you think about this for a minute, it's probably because text is readily available to crowd workers, right? So if they're sitting here and there's some text sitting in front of them, they can easily draw keywords out of the text. But if they have to listen to an audio clip, it might not be as available. So it might be more difficult for them. They might have more cognitive load. They might have to think more about the topic to generate. And so it's harder for them to generate query terms. So this trend held across all of the different lengths. And if you look in general, between the query lengths and the length of the backstory, it seems that the title queries, or the queries that were generated from titles, they're shorter. And it's probably because there's less information for crowd workers to use. But interestingly, we found that the longest queries come out from the short and actually not the long backstories. And the way we were able to at least reason about this was that perhaps the long backstories are so long that crowd workers simply don't care. They don't read it all. They get the gist of it. They read the first sentence, maybe a couple of extra words, and they do the query and they move on, right? So this was kind of surprising and interesting. The next thing we did was check the term diversity. So what we're interested here is looking at how diverse the set of terms that come out are. So we use Jacquard similarity as an overlap measure. And basically what you see is what you'd expect. With textual backstories, query diversity is lower. So there's more similarity in the queries that come out. With audio, you get more diversity. And the longer the backstory is, the more diversity you get, right? So this is probably what we would expect to happen. More interesting, we looked at the all pairs term diversity within the sets. So a similar measure, but we're still trying to measure term diversity here. And we kind of confirmed this same trend, right? So it seems like the longer the backstory is, the more diverse a set of queries and keywords that you get coming out are. So what we learned here was that different modalities, they definitely do result in query sets with different properties. And the properties depended on both the length and the delivery method of the backstory. So the next thing we did is we thought, well, how would this impact a real test collection campaign, right? If we took these queries back, we gave them to groups, research groups, we wanted to develop runs, how would it affect the creation of the test collection? And so what we did then, we went back to the corpus, we took 2 representative rankers. We could probably do this again with more rankers, but we just used 2 simple ones for now. And what we did is we simulated judgment pools to various depths, isolating the effect on the different sets of queries to examine how many documents would need to be judged if we use just that set of queries. And so on the y-axis here, I'm showing the judgments required on a per topic basis, averaged across the topics, and the pool depth would be how far down we truncate each run, right? So 10 would be, you're only looking at the top 10 documents for each run. So long audio gives you the most diversity, short audio, and then title audio. So again, kind of as you'd expect, the shorter ones give you less diversity, so therefore you surface fewer unique documents and you'd have to judge less. But interestingly, the text samples that we showed to crowd workers were even quite a lot less diverse. And, they came in a lot lower than the audio. So that gave us some kind of, this was pretty interesting, and we learned a fair bit about this. And so we then dug into why some of this sort of thing happens. And this is the thing I haven't told you yet, is that we actually captured all of the keystrokes from the crowd workers as they were generating the queries. And so what we're able to do is look at the typical behavior of the crowd workers, things that you'd expect. They use keyboard shortcuts, they use N key rollover. So when they're typing, they've got multiple keys down at the same time. This is typical of someone who's a good typist. Some users opt to use caps lock instead of holding shift. Don't know why, that's kind of interesting. Mobile and tablet users, they often made use of auto suggest or occasionally text to speech while they were doing the crowd working task. They were actually using these functions of their devices. But this is actually a really good example of why we saw more variance in the audio topics than the text ones. It was because sometimes users actually misheard the audio. So in this example, the readout said something about President Barack Obama talking about a cyber attack. They thought it was a bomber, perhaps because it was in the context of an attack. They heard a bomber, not Obama. So this brings a lot of extra diversity into the pool. I know I'm running low on time, so we also looked at dwell time. There were some interesting things. For example, we saw some users validating. Stephen Hawkins, they went away, obviously, probably looked at a web search engine and found that they'd misspelled it, so they went back and fixed it. And, of course, we found people cheating. as they're pasting in their search engine result, right? They've accidentally copied the search results, web search results for this topic. So what do we do? And we have lots of cool data. We build a demo, we visualize it, so you don't have to look at every case. So this demo is available. It exists at this URL. And so it will actually show you all of the per keystroke differences and queries that we collected. All right, so I'll stop there. Hopefully that was interesting, and hopefully it gave you a bit of an insight on this thread of work. Happy to take questions.